On the contrary, thanks to the West and the self-imposed westernization program that was going to be imposed from then on, Japan became a great power. And finally, there were also parts of Asia that managed to keep strict independence before European colonization, like Persia, Mongolia, or Thailand. We are what we think, what we are emerges from our thoughts. With our thoughts we make the world, stated the Buddha, the founder of one of the great religions. This thought seems to have played an influential role in the attitude of many Asian peoples before the West. They did not give up their identity or their interpretation of the world, although the Europeans modified their way of thinking in some cases. What sometimes provoked a dramatic clash of civilizations was also to lead to a dialogue between East and West that was to become particularly intensive in the 21st century. Peter Frankopan, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. Crowley, Conquerors. Ibid. Crowley, Conquerors. #Thomas, World Without End. Israel, the Dutch Republic. Lawrence James, Raj, The Making and Unmaking of British India. Samuel Pepys, The Diary of Samuel Pepys. Hosking, Russia and the Russians. David Landis, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, Why Some Are So Rich and Some So Poor. #James Mill, The History of British India, Vol. 1. James, Raj. John Robert Seeley, The Expansion of England, 2 courses of lectures. James, Raj. Jim McHugh, Edmund Burke and Our Present Discontents. Alain Perfit, The Immobile Empire. Julia Lovell, The Opium War, Drugs, Dreams and the Making of Modern China. Emmanuel C. Y. Su, The Rise of Modern China. William Dalrymple, Return of a King, The Battle for Afghanistan, 1839-42. James, Raj. Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins, Freedom at Midnight, How England Gave Away an Empire. James, Raj. James, Raj. Ibid. Lapierre and Collins, Freedom at Midnight. In Search of a Better World. How European culture and values were propagated by the Great Migratory Waves. One of the reasons why the Europeans succeeded at building the greatest empires in history was because they were also the most committed emigrants. While sailors, merchants, and soldiers opened up the frontiers of many territories in the world, it was the migrants who were really to determine their fate and leave an indelible mark on them. Without massive emigration of their peoples, European powers would not have been capable of accumulating so much influence, and the legacy of their cultures and Western civilization on the world would never have been so enduring. From the 16th century, European migration increased progressively, most of it settling in the Americas but also in Africa, Oceania, and to a lesser degree in Asia. As a result, many territories throughout the world and even continents were to have a majority white population. The culture of the white settlers was to take root, and in some cases replace the one that had previously existed. Their religion was to expand throughout the planet, as well as their systems of government, and their economies and laws. Cities were to be known with names that already existed in Europe, or in reference to symbols of their culture: New Spain, New England, New France, New Caledonia, New Amsterdam. All of these colonial territories were to be to a large extent copies of the countries where the settlers came from. The greatest migratory waves in history were those carried out by Europeans between the 16th and the 20th centuries. The motives that led so many inhabitants of the European continent to abandon their land where they were born are very diverse: poverty, famine, political and religious persecution, the desire to make a fortune, or simply the wish for a better life, essentially the same motives as emigrants from other races and peoples. It must also be stressed that not everyone migrated voluntarily, for the Europeans also experienced forced emigration and exile. In an opulent society full of opportunities that the Western world has enjoyed over the last decades, the idea of spending one's entire fortune on a single ticket, without a return date, that would take us to an unknown country may seem foolhardy or even a sign of utter madness. Nevertheless, for many generations the Europeans, particularly those living on the Atlantic coast, were to place all their bets on the migration card. They considered that their future was in the ships traveling toward the west, and for this reason they often risked even more than what they possessed in order to set sail to a distant land. In the majority of cases, emigrants were so poor that they did not even have the means to pay for their own journey. But the fates of emigrants were to be very diverse, as we shall later see. However, the advantage that Europeans enjoyed over other emigrants is that they migrated to territories that in most cases belonged to their countries of origin, or had been previously occupied by them, and they were also migrating at a time when the power of Europe was steadily increasing. The settlement in America took some time to be backed by a substantial number of emigrants from the discovering countries. Among Iberian colonizing pioneers, overseas possessions were initially seen as places that could provide both wealth and influence, but certainly not as ideal destinations for great contingents of their population. The New World was a place for conquistadors with a spirit of adventure, as well as zealous missionaries, but not for ordinary men. This is the reason Columbus had great difficulty recruiting a crew for his Atlantic crossings. Nevertheless, as the first proofs of wealth in the Indies were provided and the myth of El Dorado spread, an increasing number of people dreamed of starting a new life on. Another reason why emigrants were initially not so numerous was the very selective criteria established by the authorities for who could emigrate to the New World. Initially, only citizens from the Kingdom of Castile could travel to the Indies, and on top of this they were expected to be good Catholics. Another barrier was the cost of the journey. The over 20 ducats that crossing the Atlantic would cost prevented those who belonged to the humblest social strata from traveling. The Casa de Contratación was set up in Seville in order to keep track of emigration. Every traveler to the New World had to be registered in it, and according to its archives, around 56,000 people emigrated throughout the 16th century. However, this figure is probably no more than a fifth of all those who arrived in America, for many managed to cross the Atlantic without submitting to this system of control. According to the most recent estimates, between 1500 and 1650 around 437,000 Spaniards arrived in the New World, as did 100,000 Portuguese between 1500 and 1700. Not only did people from most parts of the Iberian Peninsula begin to emigrate, but also from other places in Western Europe. In particular from Italy, France, and several major cities of the Holy Roman Empire. Spain had 8 million inhabitants toward the end of the 18th century, and Portugal only 1 million, so the Iberian Peninsula was far less populated than the rest of Western Europe. If demographic pressures were generally an incentive throughout history to promote the expansion of peoples, it certainly was not in the case of these two kingdoms. It was not possible to promote large-scale emigration, neither from Spain nor from Portugal, nor from other European countries in those days. The cost of the journey and the risks and the dangers of the New World were the main factors that put people off. For the poorest sector of society, it was hard to earn a living in the cities of Seville or Salamanca, as the literature of Francisco de Quevedo, Lope de Vega, or other authors of Spain's Golden Age shows. But even so, the great majority preferred to endure poverty in their homeland than expose themselves to the perils of the Indies. Although the figures that are shown above are considerable, they are very modest if we take into account that their aim was to populate territories of enormous dimensions. Another problem was the lack of married couples and emigrants who went to America with their families, for generally those who took the risk of embarking on the adventure of the Indies tended to do it on their own and hoped to return to their homeland. This is one of the reasons why intermarriage was going to make progress in the majority of the Spanish settlements, especially in the Viceroyalty of New Spain and in Peru. The example of Cortés and Pizarro, who left mixed-race descendants, was going to be followed by many men, some of them married as good Christians like Pizarro. Others maintained sporadic relations with the indigenous women, as did Cortés. In the cities of New Spain and other settlements where white settlers cohabited with local peoples, there would emerge an increasingly mixed-race population that was brought up between their traditional customs and the Western culture of the conquistadors. For the inhabitants of the British Isles, the incentives to emigrate were far greater than in the Iberian Peninsula. The living conditions in England toward the 16th century constitute a good explanation of the reasons why colonizing America seemed increasingly attractive for the poorest sector of the population. Due to the hardship of the rural world and the lack of work, the cities were increasingly populated, and a great part of their inhabitants were crammed in slum areas with insalubrious living conditions. With such poor prospects for a better life in England, emigration to America seemed the best option, however dangerous and uncertain the journey could be. The 105 people who founded the settlement of Jamestown in 1607, after being transported by the Virginia Company, played a vital role in the history of migration to North America. Only 61 of them were still alive 3 years later, but their survival was going to pave the way for the settlers who arrived after them. Apart from poverty, another reason for emigrating to America was religious persecution. The storied Mayflower that carried 102 members of the Puritan community in 1620 was the first of many ships boarded by citizens who were persecuted or marginalized for reasons of faith. After the colony of Plymouth, founded by the so-called Pilgrim Fathers, others like Maryland and Pennsylvania were founded for religious reasons, and consequently faith was to be an essential part of those who arrived in America in search of fortune. The Mayflower Society is nowadays a very prestigious and exclusive historical society in the United States. Membership is only open to those who prove to be descendants of the Pilgrims. Its members are proud of being the living link with the first European settlers who, according to the country's official history, brought with them the principles of civil and religious liberty that became symbols of U.S. identity. The first English settlements on the shores of North America were not only scarcely populated but were also threatened by a very high mortality rate. Apart from the feared Native Americans, the hardship of the long journey, as well as the North American weather, was going to find many victims. Out of the 15,000 emigrants who arrived in Virginia between 1607 and 1622, only 2,000 survived. For this reasons, their continuity initially depended on a constant influx of immigrants. The main obstacle for migration to America was the cost of the journey, which must have been as expensive for the English as for the Spanish and Portuguese. In the early 17th century, crossing the Atlantic took a minimum of 8 weeks, and it would cost £5 plus the cost of the necessary provisions to reach America. For the majority, this implied selling all their belongings in order to pay for the journey, and very often this was not enough, and they would need some sort of external aid in order to be able to go on board. Due to the prohibitive cost of the journey, the most likely method to go to America was the indentured servitude, by which the emigrant would repay the cost of his voyage with several years' work in his posting. Until the introduction of African slaves, the work of the white emigrants plowing the land and performing all sorts of necessary tasks allowed the economy to start taking off in the early days of colonization. Up to 60% of the immigrants to the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean during the 17th century arrived with some sort of indentured servitude contract. Their conditions varied, but the most common was a 4 or 5 year contract of hard labor. For the majority, indentured servitude constituted an agreement to be slaves for several years with the aim of eventually becoming free workers. A great incentive for emigration was undoubtedly the potential ownership of such fertile lands as those in the eastern coast of North America. From 1618, the so-called headright system of land grants was introduced, by which 40 hectares of land were offered to each settler and another 100 for every person brought by him. Despite the fact that becoming a landowner in New England was a very attractive life plan, fear of the dangers of the New World explains why emigration was initially so scarce. Even promotional pamphlets were produced, like New England's Plantation, published in 1630. Here wants as yet the good company of honest Christians to bring with them horses, cows, and sheep to make good use of this fruitful land. One of them urged. Initiatives like this largely contributed to the Great Migration in the 1630s, during which 69,000 Britons crossed the Atlantic to settle in North America. Out of this figure, only 21,000 went to New England, but nevertheless the proportion of women and men who brought their families with them increased considerably, and as the settlements that were founded by the first colonists on the eastern coast of North America bore a great resemblance to England in their customs, institutions, and organization. The predominantly rural atmosphere of great farms and plantations was interrupted by small urban centers like Boston, Newport, or Charlestown. The architecture in these cities was very similar to the English, except for the important innovation of streets that were designed in perfect parallel and perpendicular alignment. As we have previously seen, the main way of earning a living for the early settlers was through the acquisition and cultivation of land. The desire to acquire and accumulate lands that settlers in the eastern coast had in common accounts for the enormous pressure to expand toward the west that existed from an early stage. North America was not a place for making a fortune overnight. Settlers only reached prosperity after many years of hard work and sacrifice. A more lucrative alternative to North America for English emigrants was the Caribbean. Sugar, the most profitable commodity in the British Empire, was cultivated in the colonies of the West Indies. Demand for sugar grew steadily until it accounted for a fifth of the British imports in the 18th century. It was much more in demand and considerably more expensive than tobacco, the main export of the North American colonies. Exports to Britain from the small Caribbean colony of St. Christopher and Nieves were 3 times larger than those from New York between 1714 and 1773. This explains why the Caribbean was much more attractive for the first emigrants, but what is less well known is that the majority of English immigrants in the 17th century, more than 60%, went to the West Indies. Nevertheless, emigration to the Caribbean dramatically declined in the 18th century. The fact that African slavery substituted for white labor, and also a high mortality rate caused by the tropical climate, ended up discouraging emigrants. Unlike the Kingdom of Castile, the English authorities did not attempt to restrict emigration to their own people, nor did they make strict selections on who should be allowed to travel in their ships. For this reason, emigration was soon to extend to Scotland, Ireland, and to a certain extent Wales, where living conditions were often even harsher than in England. In the 18th century, the majority of emigrants to America from the British Isles were Scottish or Irish. Among the Irish, those from Northern Ireland predominated those who were of Scottish origin, but Southerners were soon to proliferate as well. 2/5 of British emigrants between 1701 and 1780 were Irish. In Scotland, living conditions were much harder than in England, especially in the rural areas and the Highlands. This contributed to the development of a struggling and entrepreneurial character among the Scots that made them very good emigrants. Per mare et per terrace can be read in the motto of the MacDonald clan, one of the largest of Scottish clans, which seems to take inspiration from the Scottish diaspora throughout the world. Many Scots emigrated to Northern Ireland in the 16th century, and when the opportunity of emigration to America arose, it became so popular that according to the most critics it was to be considered like an infectious fever. Destruction of forests, land evictions in the Highlands, and above all the elimination of the clan system after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, all of these factors contributed to a dramatic rise in emigration from the mid-18th century. As Samuel Johnson described in his book A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, published in 1775, living conditions for most of the Scottish people were so bad that it was quite understandable that such high numbers considered that their only future was in the boat to America. Throughout the 19th century, Scottish migration steadily increased, particularly to Canada, to such an extent that in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, 59% of British settlers were Scottish in the first half of the 19th century. In the United States, Scottish migrants were increasingly visible, and by 1890 over 250,000 of those who had recently arrived had been born in Scotland. The experience of emigrating left important traces in Scottish literature. The great Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson wrote The Amateur Emigrant in 1880, a travel memoir based on his journey from Scotland to California, which constituted a vivid and detailed description of the migrating experience in the 19th century. For those who were used to the adversity of the Scottish rural world, living conditions in North America constituted a major improvement, and this accounts for their rapid integration in American society. The seventh U.S. President, Andrew Jackson, was the son of Scots-Irish colonists who had emigrated to America. President William McKinley was also of Scottish ancestry, although much more remote. Not only were there many Scottish surnames in high-level U.S. politics, but also in industry. An extraordinary case of success in America was that of the famous tycoon Andrew Carnegie, who was born in Scotland in 1835 and arrived in Pittsburgh when he was only 12 years old. Carnegie led the expansion of the steel industry in the late 19th century, with such success that by the end of his career he was identified as the richest man in the world. His career as a philanthropist was no less influential. 3,000 public libraries were founded throughout the English-speaking world with his funds. He also donated large sums to educational, cultural, and scientific institutions that are still influential. Among the Celtic world, the emigrants par excellence were undoubtedly the Irish. No people in Europe have had stronger motives for emigrating than the Irish. Apart from being as affected by poverty and barren lands as the Scots, the Irish had strong religious and political reasons to abandon their homeland, for they were oppressed by the English. In fact, as they were colonized by England, they considered themselves to be the first victims of its imperial expansion. In the 17th and 18th century, British laws forbade Irish Catholics from owning land and occupying public office. Marginalized in their own homeland, they could not have had better reasons for emigrating. If the Irish often lamented that their country was too near England, on the other hand they had the good fortune of being geographically the closest European country to the eastern coast of North America. From the 18th century, the number of Irish emigrants who settled on the other side of the Atlantic steadily grew. It was increasingly difficult to find an Irish family that did not have relatives in America, and family networks contributed to a constant inflow of migrants, particularly to the city of Boston. For very good reasons, Irish President Mary Robinson stated in 2001 that spiritually Ireland was nearer Boston than Berlin. This has certainly been the case for the last 3 centuries. From the 18th century on, not only did population from Ireland and the British Isles arrive in North America but also from other places in Europe. News about the opportunities that could be found on the other side of the Atlantic spread rapidly through continental Europe, where an increasing number of people decided that their future was in America. The frontiers of the first British colonies in America were open to all European migrants willing to settle and work there, and for all those who were not British or Irish there was no barrier that prevented them from succeeding in America, apart from the initial disadvantage of not speaking English. In the case of the Dutch, their presence in North America is as old as the British. After the foundation of Fort Orange by Dutch settlers in 1614, 30 families traveled in order to settle in the colony of New Amsterdam. Over the following decades, the Dutch West India Company offered their fellow countrymen free land on the banks of the Hudson River, and as a result of this a thriving community of Dutch settlers was to emerge. Among the families that arrived in those days were the Van Burens, from whom U.S. President Martin Van Buren descended. The Roosevelts as well, who apart from making a fortune 2 centuries later, became one of the most outstanding American political families with 2 great presidents, Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Toward the mid-17th century, New Amsterdam had 8,000 Dutch inhabitants. In Delaware, the Swedish founded a small colony where around 50 families settled, but this was to be annexed by Holland. After the English conquest of New Amsterdam in 1664, renaming the city New York, the population tacitly accepted a change of sovereignty. In this way, the first substantial injection of population from continental Europe to the British 13 colonies was to take place. As regards the French contribution, France was the most populous nation in Europe when the colonization of North America began, but as we have seen before, French immigration to its colonies on the other side of the Atlantic was very scarce in spite of all attempts made by the Crown to promote it. In the case of France in the 16th and 17th centuries, colonizing was more appropriate for adventurers and missionaries than for families that wished to improve their lives. This explains why in the early 18th century the population of New France was not even a tenth of the population of the 13 colonies. Nevertheless, the French did emigrate to America for religious reasons. The Huguenot community was persecuted in France for practicing their Protestant faith, and for the same reasons they were not allowed to settle in New France. As a result of this, they opted to migrate to the English-speaking East Coast, particularly to the colony of Pennsylvania. The largest contingent of population from continental Europe that was to arrive in North America was German. The German princely states had similar problems to the British, which made emigration very attractive for many of their inhabitants, but they did not have overseas colonies. This situation changed toward the end of the 17th century. The German lawyer, Franz Daniel Pastorius, arrived in Pennsylvania in 1683 to buy 15,000 acres of land on behalf of a group of Quaker countrymen who were eager to leave Europe. Germantown was founded in these lands where German customs prevailed despite the fact that they were in British America, and Pastorius was to be the burgomaster until the end of his life. The first German families arriving there transformed the settlement into a prosperous city that was very similar to the German towns in Europe, and its economy was based on the textile industry. From 1714, when the first member of the German House of Hanover, George I, ascended the British throne, German emigration to the American colonies was eagerly promoted from the Crown. About 14,000 Germans arrived in America from England. Throughout the 18th century, companies proliferated in America specializing in financing trips to America for German emigrants. According to the British Parliament, in 1716 a third of the population of Pennsylvania was German. Many also settled in the lands of New York, founding the cities of Mannheim, Oppenheim, and Herkimer. In Virginia they were to settle in Germanna, which specialized in ironmongering, while Maryland attracted many German Catholics. Due to all this migration, German became the second most commonly spoken language in the 13 colonies. German communities rapidly thrived and made very substantial contributions to the economic development of British America and later the United States. The most outstanding example of success among German immigrants was undoubtedly that of John Jacob Astor, who arrived in New York in 1784. The ambitious and smart German businessman specialized in trading with hides, but also invested in other lucrative businesses as real estate speculation in New York. He made his companies so profitable that he became the first multi-millionaire in the history of the United States, and on his death in 1848 he was the wealthiest man in the country. He was followed by an influential dynasty in business and politics in the Atlantic world. One of its most famous members in Britain was Nancy Astor, the American-born socialite who married Viscount Astor and eventually became the first woman member of Parliament to sit in the House of Commons. It has been assumed that as the colonization of America made progress and the migration of Europeans increased, European culture was inexorably imposed. Nevertheless, it was not the case initially due to the fact that the majority of those who crossed the Atlantic between the 16th and 18th centuries did not come from Europe but from Africa. From the 16th century, the importation of African slaves expanded rapidly across America. Initially, the slaves started to be used in the Spanish colonies of Cuba and Hispaniola. Later they were employed in great numbers in the plantations of Brazil, and from there the habit of owning African slaves spread across the European colonies in the Caribbean and finally to North America. The fact that the development of the plantations, and consequently of the colonial economy, depended on African labor contributed to the rapid increase of its demand. The white man in America was increasingly dependent on the black man. 1.5 million Europeans had emigrated to America toward the end of the 18th century, but 4 times more Africans were transferred there to serve them. More than 70% of the passengers in the ships who crossed the Atlantic between 1589 and 1820 were African. It has been calculated that from 1600 to the end of the 19th century, over 12 million African slaves were brought to America. The reason why the figure of black population is so high is not only due to the increasing demand but also to the fact that mortality rate among them was very high and reproduction very low. Shipments of slaves were constantly needed in order to maintain a stable black population. The fact that the black population was more numerous than the white in America from the 16th to the 18th century contributed to the expansion of the culture of the African people, and not just the European, in the New World. Blacks were forced to live in a world that was dominated by whites. They lost their native African languages, eventually replaced their religious beliefs with Christianity, and were also to be known by the names and surnames given by their owners. In spite of all this, African culture was initially clearly visible in any plantation or any place where black population concentrated. In music, gastronomy, and also their beliefs and way of speaking, the African legacy was clearly perceptible. After slaves were set free, African culture was increasingly visible in some colonies. In the case of Brazil, the black population was to have much influence in its popular culture and folklore. In the coasts of present-day Venezuela, Colombia, Suriname, or Guyana, and especially in the Caribbean islands where black population constituted a majority, the culture and customs of Africa were particularly visible, as they still are. Had the same distribution between black and white populations in America been maintained, the Atlantic civilization would have had a strong African presence. Nevertheless, as a result of demographic changes in the 19th century, the presence of black people was to be more marginal. The importation of an African population to America came to an end after the prohibition of the slave trade in 1807. On the other hand, in the 19th century, the biggest wave of white emigration from the other side of the Atlantic was to take place. From then, black Americans ceased to be a majority in many places, and were even to become an ethnic minority, especially in the United States. As a result of this, the Atlantic civilization became a Western civilization, which, as according to the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, is. In 1798, the English cleric Thomas Malthus published his essay on the principle of population, which was going to become one of the most influential books that have been written in the Western world about population. In this essay, Reverend Malthus analyzes the consequences that the increase in population could have on society and warned that contrary to what was thought in those days, the constant rise in population would have devastating effects on Britain and on any other country. One obvious consequence of the rise in population was the increase in workforce, which leads to the reduction of salaries, explained the cleric. A much more devastating impact of demographic growth was the shortage of food, for Malthus explained in his work that a critical moment would be reached in which agricultural and livestock production would not be sufficiently high as to feed the entire population. Thomas Malthus's apocalyptic theory about the consequences of population growth had a great impact on Britain in his day. As a result of it, in 1800 the first population census was commissioned, according to which the population of Great Britain was approximately 10 million. Although Malthus's prediction never came true, so far, it did contribute to raise social awareness about the dangers of population growth in his time. The natural formulae that traditionally prevented the increase in population were wars, plagues, and famines, as Malthus explained in his book, and the less painful alternatives were through birth control, which in those days could only be implemented through celibacy or delaying the marriage age. One third option to prevent the undesired increase in population was emigration. This is the reason why both Great Britain and many other European governments promoted emigration, especially those with overseas colonies where the spare population could be sent. The fact that it was the poorer sector of society that was forced by circumstances to emigrate constituted a relief for the governments, for the problems associated with widespread poverty were reduced and the Malthusian nightmare was in this way scared away. Without reading Malthus, a high percentage of Europeans were well aware of the problems created by overpopulation. Shortages of jobs and food in rural areas provoked emigration to the cities, and in many of these the situation was not much better. Although prospects for the future were bleak for many workers in old Europe, the advantage that those who were born in the 19th century enjoyed over their ancestors was that opportunities for emigrating were far greater. The favorite destination for European migrants was the United States of America. The fact that several European countries already had communities of immigrants settled in this country intensified emigration throughout the 19th century. To be the first independent nation in the Americas was also an incentive for many emigrants who did not belong to any colonial power. Above all, the United States needed immigrants to stimulate its economy and populate the territories that it was acquiring, and the possibilities of making a fortune there were greater than in any other place in the world. British emigration continued throughout the 19th century, particularly from Scotland and Ireland as we have seen, although the fact that emigrants from Great Britain had opportunities for migrating to so many places of its vast empire contributed to their expansion throughout the planet. Irish immigration to the United States steadily increased throughout the 19th century. The rebellious Irish were naturally attracted to the United States as a country that had managed to break away from British sovereignty. From the 1840s it became not only a land of opportunity but also the country that allowed them to recover from the most traumatic experience in their history, the potato famine. The famine caused by the potato blight of 1845 provoked the loss of almost a fourth of Ireland's population and plunged the island into an economic crisis that was to last for several decades. Out of almost 2 million Irish who abandoned their country in the decade of the potato famine, the majority went to the United States. Toward 1850 the Irish constituted one-fourth of the population in the cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. Earning a living in the United States did not seem easy for them, facing prejudices of the English against the Irish, the Protestants against the Catholics, and the rich against the poor, which explain why the Irish community was initially so marginal. Despite the fact that equality of all citizens before the law was proclaimed by the U.S. Constitution, and the political establishment took pride in the country's egalitarian ethos, not all immigrants were equal, the legacy of the struggle among European people was going to be present in the great American nation. Nevertheless, the Irish managed to make progress and gradually overcome all obstacles until they managed to reach the economic and political pinnacle of American society. One of the Irish emigrants who left their island during the decade of the potato famine was Patrick Kennedy, who emigrated from the county of Wexford and settled in Boston in 1849, where he earned a living as a tanner. From such humble origins, his son Patrick Kennedy managed to become an influential politician in Massachusetts, but this was only the beginning of the political rise of the Kennedy family in the United States. The other great contingent of European emigrants was German. The crisis of the 1840s and the 1848 revolution provoked a massive exodus of Germans from many of its kingdoms and princely states. Around 1 million settled in the United States over the following decade. Not only did they settle in cities that had been founded by their ancestors, but they expanded throughout the country. In New York, the German community was substantial. The influence of revolutionary exiles could be felt with the founding in 1867 of the First American Socialist Party. In the following years, German immigration intensified, and toward the 1880s another million entered the United States. Milwaukee and Cincinnati became the two main centers of German culture in that country. Thanks to the entrepreneurial and industrial spirit that characterized the Germans, several of them followed the path of John Jacob Astor and joined the country's business elite. Another country that played an active role populating North America was Sweden, from whence more than 1 million emigrants left in the 19th century. From Norway, around 750,000 people emigrated between 1820 and 1900, the equivalent to 4/5 of its population, and in Holland around 350,000 people left. Generally, apart from the English, the Scottish, and the Welsh, immigration from Northern Europe and the Protestant countries in Europe was more welcomed by the political elite and the government of the United States. In fact, apart from Britain, the three countries where the U.S. opened agencies to promote emigration were Germany, Sweden, and Norway. Prejudices against the Catholics provoked pressures especially from the Republican Party to restrict the arrival of Irish and German Catholics, and in this way preserve the culture with which the majority of the people from the U.S. were identified. Despite the fact that the French Empire offered many attractive options for the French who wished to emigrate, the opportunities in the United States attracted many of them. Some also arrived there through Canada. In total, around 700,000 Frenchmen settled in the United States in the 19th century. ####. From the 1870s onward, emigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe began to proliferate. In Italy, the demographic explosion and the decline in living conditions in both the urban and rural centers provoked a wave of emigration toward the end of that century, and the United States was going to be the main recipient. Over the last decade of the 19th century, more than 700,000 Italians entered the country. The Greeks also started to emigrate to North America in those days, and even the Portuguese, who were usually more attracted by Brazil. Austrians, Hungarians, Poles, Czechs, Serbians, and other nationalities in Eastern Europe also went in search of a better life to the United States, and finally Russians. Despite the fact that the Russians had many opportunities for emigration within their huge terrestrial empire, this did not allow them to escape poverty or political oppression. This is the reason why emigration to the United States became popular, to such an extent that according to the data of the Frontier Controls, over 3 million Russians reached this country between the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. Among the Russian emigrant population, Jews proliferated, especially from 1881, when persecution against this community dramatically increased. 2 million Jews emigrated to the United States between 1881 and 1914, and the majority came from Russia. Crossing the Atlantic was an expensive and risky adventure for the Irish, the Scots, or any other people in Western Europe. It was particularly the case for the Poles or the Russians, who lived so far away from the main ports that were connected with America. It took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and much longer if one was traveling to South America. The ships crammed with emigrants who were forced to travel in very poor hygienic conditions required very good health and a capacity to endure adversity. In 1710, a typhoid epidemic broke out in a ship with 2,810 German passengers, causing the death of 446 of them. Death and sickness were inseparable companions of the transoceanic cruise, and those who arrived at their destination were always fewer than those who left. Fortunately for the emigrants in the first decades of the 19th century, traveling conditions started to improve. Technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution were soon to be applied to maritime transport. Steamships with metallic hulls, pushed by propellers, replaced the traditional sailing boats. They also increased in size and comfort, and were specially designed by the naval companies to board hundreds of passengers for the long journeys across the sea. As a consequence of these changes, the era of great ocean liners was going to start. From the mid-19th century, great liners started to proliferate that managed to make transoceanic journeys considerably shorter as well as much more comfortable, and last but not least, they became much cheaper. The great 19th century transatlantic ships constituted an essential contribution to the power of Europe in the world, almost as important as the caravels in the 15th century. If these made the discovery of America possible, the former made mass emigration possible to America and other points on the planet. Without them, Western civilization would not have been so predominant. The era of the great transatlantic liners contributed to improve the relationship between Europe and America in general, particularly between the United States and Britain. It was then that the relationship between the two countries started to be really special. The ships that sailed across the ocean with increasing frequency not only contributed to make more emigrants travel but also businessmen in search of opportunities. Among the many business opportunities offered by the United States, the railway played a very important role, as it was growing so rapidly that in the decade of the 1840s it had more miles of railway track than the whole of Europe, and a considerable amount of British capital was invested in it, as well as Dutch and German. The relationship between the British aristocracy and the American elite was progressively strengthened since then. Marriages between members of their families, which until then would have scandalized the British upper classes, became increasingly frequent. Particularly famous was the marriage of the rich heiress Consuelo Vanderbilt with the Duke of Marlborough, or the one between Randolph Churchill with Jenny Jerome, the daughter of a New York stockbroker, whose eldest son was destined to become one of the greatest symbols of the Anglo-American relationship, Winston Churchill. Literature was going to reflect very well how the transatlantic relationship evolved through the century of great migrations. Charles Dickens traveled to the United States on 2 occasions, where his books were nationally popular. He left written records of his impressions that were often not positive in his American diary, and also in his famous novel Martin Chuzzlewit. But the most detailed and subtle descriptions of the Anglo-American world in the 19th century were those of the Boston writer Henry James, who reflects in his works their mutual admiration as well as the grudges and historic prejudices. James lived between the 2 countries for most of his life and eventually became a British citizen. The extraordinary territorial expansion experienced by the United States through the 19th century would not have been sustainable in the long run if it had not been backed by a very considerable increase in population. In this aspect, the great waves of European emigrants were essential. From the major cities on the East Coast to the most remote places, Europeans from very diverse origins gradually settled in this great country and made it their home. European migration was also a very important element contributing to the spectacular growth of the American economy from the mid-19th century and the transformation of the United States into the largest economy in the world from the early 20th century. The other major North American destination for emigration was Canada. Canada in the early 19th century was, as it continues to be today, one of the less populated areas in the world, but it was also one of the richest in fertile lands and mineral resources. Britain promoted emigration to its most extensive colony with much success throughout the 19th century. In another period of intense emigration that was to be known as the Great Migration, from 1815 to 1850, 80,000 Britons reached Canada. The cultural impact of this migration wave was considerable, for the population of French origin, which until then had been the largest contingent, was transformed into a minority. The emigration of French-speaking inhabitants from Quebec to the United States that took place at that time was mainly the result of resentment against the British. In 1851, gold was discovered on the West Coast, provoking the arrival of a great influx of emigrants from both Europe and the United States. 1 year later, Britain declared British Columbia officially to be a colony, with the aim of ensuring that this region would remain under British sovereignty due to the increasing interest of the United States to annex the territory. Although the gold rush did not last for long, it helped attract population to this remote region and transform it into a very attractive destination for emigrants. The Great Migration contributed to unify this huge North American territory under British dominion, although with a high level of independence. In 1838, the governor of British North America, the Earl of Durham, presented a report that was going to be very influential in the history of the British Empire. In this report, he recommended that all territories in Canada should be represented in a great autonomous parliament. In this way, the loyalty of the colonials to the motherland would be guaranteed by granting them the maximum level of independence. Durham seemed to have learned the lessons of history, and he made a very important contribution with this report to prevent an armed conflict similar to the one in the 13 colonies, which would have led Canadians to break away from Britain. Despite the essential role played by the Great Migration in the early development of Canada, its population was still insignificant for such a vast territory. In 1871, the population of Canada was about 3.5 million. For this reason, in the 1870s its government started to promote emigration in Scandinavia, Germany, and Central Europe, announcing itself as the last and best West, which led many Europeans to consider this colony as a better alternative to the United States. This publicity campaign was responsible for an increasing number of emigrants from diverse European countries who were to join the English and French-speaking settlers in Canada. While emigration contributed to strengthen links between North America and Europe, other parts of the American continent were to experiment with a similar process. The American dream that was so deeply associated with the United States was also to take place in several other parts of the Americas. The dismemberment of the Iberian empires in America did not constitute the end of the Spanish and Portuguese influence on the other side of the Atlantic. The great migratory movements of Spain and Portugal were still to come after the emergence of the Latin American nations. Spain did not have an excess of population to send to America as Britain or Germany did, nevertheless the economic need for emigration was constant for many Spaniards in the 19th century. In an agricultural economy like Spain's, a big percentage of the population was exposed to the problems of the rural world. Except for the aristocracy and the small bourgeoisie, emigration for the rest of the population constituted the only opportunity for acquiring wealth and climbing the social ladder. After the 1820s, the only remaining colonies where the Spaniards could emigrate were Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Cuba became by far the most important, and it was going to attract the largest percentage of Spaniards who left their homeland in search of a better life. The most outstanding of these emigrants who thrived on the Caribbean island was the Marquis of Camillas, Antonio Lopez. Antonio Lopez started working in Cuba as a teenager. Once he had saved enough, he founded a transport company that steadily expanded until it became the Transatlantic Company, which controlled a large part of the transport between Spain and Latin America. He also used his fortune to promote diverse business ventures with the Spanish colonial world. He founded a colonial bank and also made incursions in the tobacco trade, founding the General Tobacco Company of the Philippines, which was going to expand to the point of becoming the first Spanish multinational company. Lopez was rewarded by King Alfonso XVIII for his prominent role in the business world with the title of Marquis of Camillas, his hometown in northern Spain, where he also founded a university. The Marquis of Camillas was the most outstanding example of the so-called Indianos, as those who made a fortune in America were known, and they played a very important role in the economic development of Spain in the 19th and 20th century. The legacy of the Indianos can be perceived in many places throughout northern Spain. Apart from great mansions of colonial style that they used to build on returning to their homeland, those who were wealthy enough would make donations for important social works. Their example was going to inspire many young Spanish workers in search of a better life. The Indianos became a great symbol of success in the colonial era and afterward as well, as several great modern Spanish novelists show, from Benito Pérez Galdós to Pío Baroja. In one of the streets of the northern town of Santander, an old plaque from the Transatlantic Company founded by Camillas announces monthly journeys to Havana, Veracruz, Montevideo, and Buenos Aires. From the last decades of the 19th century to the mid-20th century, many inhabitants of this province boarded one of these ships with the hope of finding a better life, for hope was the main fuel for emigrants. In other ports of northern Spain and also in Barcelona, Cadiz, or the Canary Islands, ships full of workers setting out to do the Americas, as it was. Spanish emigration intensified in the last decades of the 19th century and was to continue in the 20th century. Between 1882 and 1935, around 4 million Spaniards left their country. Cuba was the main source of attraction until it ceased to be a colony in 1898. The second most attractive posting was Argentina, then Mexico, Chile, and Uruguay, and Brazil was also included among the options for Spaniards. Only 15% of Spanish emigrants opted for non-American destinations. Most of them went to the Philippines, and the less adventurous opted for Morocco and Algeria. Unlike migrants from Northern Europe, many Spaniards did not consider emigration as something permanent, and they hoped to return to their homeland as soon as they could. In fact, 57% of those who left between 1882 and 1935 returned to Spain. There was a lot of temporary immigration, particularly to the rural zones in Cuba or Brazil, where many Spanish peasants traveled to work for only the harvest months and returned thereafter. As regards Portugal, its population was to show an extraordinary migratory spirit, particularly to Brazil, the pearl of its empire. Until the early 18th century, few Portuguese were attracted by Brazil. Nevertheless, with the discovery of gold during that century, immigration rapidly increased. It was then that Portuguese was imposed as the official language in the huge colony, as more and more people from Portugal settled in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, Salvador de Bahia, and many other smaller settlements that they would found throughout the Brazilian coast. But mass migration did not take place until the second half of the 19th century, as in the rest of America. The recent independence of Brazil did not constitute an obstacle for the young nation to be filled with Portuguese immigrants. On the contrary, the political break did not affect its economic and cultural ties with Portugal. After large contingents of migrants arrived in the major cities, migration to the rural areas ensued, for as a result of the abolition of slavery, the demand for labor intensified, and many peasants were to start the American adventure working in the plantations. In total, more than 300,000 Portuguese emigrated to Brazil in the last decades of the 19th century. Brazil was also to attract much German emigration. In 1820, New Freiburg was founded by several families of German and Swiss settlers. After independence, Emperor Pedro I, who had married a Habsburg princess, welcomed German emigration, especially to populate the region of Rio Grande do Sul, and German population progressively increased over the rest of the century. Just as it happened with its North American equivalents, Nova Freiburg and other small settlements were to be perfect copies of German towns on the banks of the Amazon. However, toward the end of the 19th century, the most numerous contingent of Europeans in Brazil was the Italians. After United States and Argentina, Brazil was the favorite destination for the huge wave of Italian migration that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century. The total number of Italians who entered Brazil between 1876 and 1920 was around 2,200,000. Integration in their country of adoption was easy for the Italians, and the second generation already considered themselves Brazilians, but this did not prevent Italian influence from being considerable in this vast country. Around a third of the white population in Brazil nowadays claims to have Italian ancestry. Apart from Portuguese, Italians, Germans, and Spaniards, Brazil was going to attract emigrants from other European nationalities, especially Poland, Austria, Ukraine, and Russia. Due to this emigration, São Paulo and the main cities of this great country became a mosaic of European cultures that cohabited more or less peacefully along. A very special destination for European migration was Argentina. The country that emerged from the old viceroyalty of the River Plate was going to become one of the largest in the American continent. From the city of Buenos Aires, the successors of the founding leader José San Martín were going to face the great challenge of conquering, populating, and governing over great tracts of land. The frontier spirit that was so characteristic in the United States was reproduced in several South American countries, particularly in Argentina. In the 1830s, Argentine President Juan Manuel de Rosas promoted what was to be known as the Patagonia Campaign, with the aim of occupying land in Patagonia and the Pampas, devote them to agriculture and livestock, and also expel the indigenous tribes that inhabited them. For decades later, the so-called conquest of the desert took place with the aim of taking possession of Patagonia and preventing Chile from taking the lead. Another consequence of this conquest was the expulsion and elimination of the Indians who lived there by Argentine troops. Argentina emerged from the mid-19th century as one of the most attractive countries for European emigrants. Moreover, the Argentine government promoted European migration very actively, to the point of including this intention in the 1853 constitution, which stated that the government will promote European emigration. Juan Bautista Alberti, who largely influenced the content of this constitution, published a book at that time on the organization of the Argentine Republic, in which he explained that populating is a civilizing act when it is done with civilized people, which means with people from civilized Europe. In several of his works, Alberti not only argued that Argentina should be open to European settlers, but he also discriminated between Europeans who were more civilized than others, and for this reason he insisted on the need to attract immigrants from Anglo-Saxon and Germanic countries. Although British, Irish, and German migration was going to be intensive, from the decade of the 1870s emigrants from all over Europe were going to reach Argentina, both the civilized and educated as Alberti wished, as well as those who were backward and illiterate. Even emigrants from the Ottoman Empire were going to reach Argentine ports. The Argentine government was probably the most active in all the Americas in the promotion of European migration. Apart from opening agencies in the most important European cities and subsidizing the journey to Argentina for the poorest emigrants, it actively promoted the colonization of the remotest territories. The results were extraordinary. In 1869, Argentina had a population of 1,800,000 inhabitants, of which 160,000 were Europeans who had recently arrived. In 1895 it had increased to 3,954,911 inhabitants. Over the following decades the emigrant population grew to such an extent that in 1930 there were 6,330,000 emigrants, of which over 3 million were permanent settlers, and the rest was a floating population that remained in the country for a certain period. ######. Apart from those who descended from the original Spanish settlers, the British were the oldest community among those who settled in the country from the mid-19th century. British investment in Argentina was going to be very important, especially in the most vital sectors of its economy like the railways. Apart from being the wealthiest of all recent settlers, the British community earned much respect among the Argentines, and consequently their customs were to take root in the country, particularly sports like polo and soccer, as well as their social habits. The Irish were also to proliferate, particularly after the potato famine. Another large community in Argentina was that of the French, due to the fact that they were the second most important European investor in the country. Nevertheless, over the last 3 decades of the 19th century, great waves of emigrants were to arrive from South, Central, and Eastern Europe. The most important migrant contingent was clearly the Italian. When the first population census was carried out in Argentina in 1869, the Italians constituted 33% of the foreign population. This was only the beginning, for in 1895 they were almost 500,000 inhabitants and they represented 48% of the total foreign population. Although the majority were poor emigrants from the south, soon Italian surnames were to proliferate in the world of business, politics, and culture. From the humblest districts to the most exclusive circles of Buenos Aires and other important cities, Italian influence was to be very visible, leaving a deep mark on the formation of the Argentine identity. The Spaniards were also to be very numerous, with 1,400,000 settling in Argentina between 1880 and 1914. The great majority came from Galicia, which explains why Spaniards were popularly known as Gallegos in Argentina. Another contribution to the mosaic of European cultures in this country was that of the Russians. The first ones to arrive were the German Russians from the Volga region, in order to colonize the lands of the Pampas, but soon the presence of Russians was to increase dramatically toward the end of the 19th century. Ukrainians, Poles, Romanians, and representatives of other Central European nationalities were also to arrive. Among the Russian citizens there was a high percentage of Jews, as had happened with those who arrived in the United States. Many arrived thanks to Baron Maurice de Hirsch, a Jewish entrepreneur and philanthropist of German ancestry who founded a Jewish community in Buenos Aires and other Jewish settlements in rural Argentina. The internal colonization of Argentina is full of extraordinary tales of adventure, endurance, delusions of grandeur, and even madness. A very good example was that of the Julius Popper, a modern conquistador who went to colonize Tierra del Fuego, where there were abundant gold deposits. Popper aimed at founding a settlement under the name of Atlanta, patented a gold harvester that could have been a great business, and consolidated a small empire in this remote land that was controlled by his own private army. But he was also to go down in history as the person responsible for the destruction of the indigenous tribes that inhabited this remote region. There were also stories of people who made fortunes in a very short time, like the Italian Antonio Devoto, founder of the Bank of Italy and River Plate, and who also founded the district in Buenos Aires that bears his name. Perhaps what gave Argentina such a strong European character was not only the fact that its emigration was overwhelmingly European, but also that other races did not have as much presence as in other countries of the Americas. The majority of the indigenous population in the Pampas, Patagonia, and the northern part of the country was expelled or exterminated with the arrival of the white settlers. As regards the population of Africans, the Viceroyalty of the River Plate had a large population of slaves until the 18th century, but a good part of them had vanished or were killed, and those who remained was too small in number to have a visible presence. The great Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges explained very well the difference between the Argentine identity and that of the rest of Latin America. The Peruvians descend from the Incas, the Mexicans descend from the Aztecs, and the Argentines descend from the ships. The city of Buenos Aires is the most evident proof of the European influence that was predominant in the construction of Argentina. That beautiful Argentine city seems like the capital of an empire that never existed, as André Malraux defined it. It reminds the visitor of Paris, Madrid, Milan, or other cities of the old continent, and it is one of the best reproductions of the urban European atmosphere that has been made in the Americas. Toward the end of the 19th century, all nations of Europe seemed to be represented in Argentina. Its constant influx of European population contributed to keep very strong links with the old continent, yet despite the fact that the recently arrived emigrants had their hearts on the other side of the Atlantic, they were to be quickly assimilated by their country of adoption. A plan of compulsory national education in Spanish and the opportunities that the vast country offered for all those who had recently arrived contributed to make the second generation of emigrants become Argentines loyal to their new homeland. As the senator of Irish origin Eduardo Casey stated, Europe is nothing compared to our country, the richest and the greatest in the world. Argentina was one of the best destinations in the world for those Europeans who, frustrated in their countries of origin, went there in search of opportunities. This explains the pride showed by first and second generation Argentines. Despite the fact that America was the favorite destination for European emigration, a considerable number of alternatives emerged as empires expanded. One of the farthest and most enigmatic places for migration was Australia. On January 19, 1788, a fleet with 737 convicts arrived in Botany Bay, near present-day Sydney. This crew of convicts was the first group of European settlers in the British colonization of Australia. Between 1788 and 1853, about 123,000 men and 25,000 women were sentenced to exile in Australia. The crimes for which one could be condemned to Australian ostracism were very diverse. Crimes against property proliferated, and there were also many political prisoners. A fourth part of those who were deported to Australia were Irish. Nevertheless, although it was a nation founded by convicts, what seems extraordinary was that it was soon to become a colony where the majority of its inhabitants were loyal subjects of the crown and where one could prosper and live peacefully. The person who was primarily responsible for this transformation was Lachlan Macquarie, who was governor of Australia from 1809 to 1821. Macquarie decided that Australia should be a land for atonement rather than punishment. In order to achieve this, he decided to employ the prisoners in the construction of the city of Sydney, and he managed to transform it into a model colonial city during his mandate. The elegant buildings built by the prisoners constituted the introduction of Western classic architecture in Oceania. But above all, Macquarie gave the convicts great incentives to become good citizens, even offering 12 hectares of land to those who finished their sentence. Apart from settling down as farmers or stock breeders, many ex-convicts that were not allowed to return to Britain opened up businesses in Sydney. The most outstanding example was probably that of Samuel Terry, a thief from Manchester who went into the hostelry business and also became a pawnbroker, managing to consolidate a fortune in the decade of the 1820s that made him the richest man in the colony. Nowhere else in the world were ex-convicts given better opportunities for re-entering society. As a result, deportation to Australia evolved from being feared to becoming the ideal destination for many of those who were sentenced to prison. Despite the fact that there were more free citizens than prisoners after 1823, Australia attracted very little emigration, mainly due to the distance, as the United States and Canada seemed better and cheaper alternatives for British migrants. Nevertheless, the discovery of gold in Victoria, to the southwest of Sydney, in 1851 provoked a rapid influx. In those days Australia had around 400,000 inhabitants. 1 decade later the population had increased to 1,150,000. Victoria evolved from having only 18% of the settlers to 47%, as it had been demonstrated from the times when Columbus reached America. No land was too distant for Europeans at the prospect of acquiring gold. But apart from the lucky few who managed to discover gold, the main business for the settlers in this island was stock breeding, especially with sheep. As regards the Aboriginals, the impact of the arrival of the British settlers was equally harmful as it had been for the indigenous peoples in the Americas. The British brought diseases that were lethal for them, and the Aboriginal population declined to the point of becoming a very small minority in their own land. The land occupied by the settlers for livestock and agriculture was also going to reduce their natural habitat. The colonization of New Zealand, the other great colony in Oceania, was to follow different paths. Its main promoter was Edward Gibbon Wakefield, a wealthy British entrepreneur who wished to create a new system of colonization. Wakefield was deeply influenced by the Malthusian theories that were fashionable in his time and which considered colonization to be the solution to the problems of overpopulation and poverty that affected the main cities in Britain. His plan was to set up a company that would occupy land and exploit it, founding colonies by means of agreements with entrepreneurs, artisans, and workers. The New Zealand Company was created with this aim, and the first ships were sent in 1839 to start the colonization of these islands. Nevertheless, Edward Wakefield never enjoyed the support of the government circles, and for this reason the Crown eventually decided to formally occupy New Zealand. This was mainly to avoid the problems that this company could create, and also to protect British interests against the French and American whaling ships that roamed around the coasts. Another reason why the Crown took this island was in order to prevent confrontations with the Maori people, whose warlike spirit was well known by all those who approached these islands. In 1840 the British Crown signed the Treaty of Waitangi with the Maori, by which a governor was sent to New Zealand. The land was recognized as property of the Maori, and they were to have the same rights as the British citizens. Despite the fact that the treaty seemed to leave the relationship between the two parties very clear, the Maori interpretation of the treaty was different. As they expected to obtain the protection of the British government and were going to be outraged by the arrival of an increasing number of European settlers who occupied their lands. After neutralizing the power of the New Zealand Company by means of economic compensation, from then on the government supervised the arrival of British settlers who were initially only 37,000 in 1871, but this figure trebled by the early 20th century. A big percentage of them were Scottish, but not all immigrants were British, for New Zealand was also to attract emigrants from Central Europe, especially from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 2 decades after it was officially established as a colony, the majority of the population of New Zealand was white. Another increasingly attractive destination for European migration from the 19th century was South Africa. In spite of the huge distance, South Africa was a place of great strategic value. Its vast unpopulated territories offered many opportunities for the settler with an entrepreneurial spirit. And from there the possibilities of expansion toward the north seemed to have no limits, where a whole continent was still to be discovered. The 20,000 Boer settlers who lived in South Africa in the early 19th century were well aware of the privilege of being the first European settlers in this part of the world, which they had transformed into their homeland. Sharing this paradise with British settlers proved to be a major challenge for them and led to several conflicts. After Cape Town was ceded by Holland in 1815, the British government considered this territory as another ideal destination for its migrant population. In 1820, the first British contingent reached South Africa. 5,000 settlers reached Cape Town, determined to prosper there. The clashes between the British and Boer community was going to be the cause of the first major European incursion into the interior of the African continent. Between 1835 and 1843, the so-called Great Trek took place. Around 15,000 Boer families set out on a journey to the north of Cape Town with the aim of founding new settlements where they could govern themselves and decide their own future. The idea of traveling so far in order to earn a living farming or cattle breeding did not seem particularly appealing for either the British or emigrants from any other place in Europe. What really attracted them was the search for gold or precious metals. For this reason, the discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa changed its fate. The news of the first discoveries of gold and diamonds north of Cape Colony attracted thousands of emigrants from Britain. The city of Kimberley, where the largest deposits of diamonds and gold were found, experienced an extraordinary increase in population through the 1870s. By 1873 it had 40,000 inhabitants, becoming in this way the second most densely populated city in South Africa. Diamonds made the businessman Cecil Rhodes and his business partners from the De Beers Company immensely rich, and contributed to make of South Africa one of the most prosperous colonies in the British Empire. Apart from South Africa, the African continent was generally seen by Europeans as a territory that was far too hostile for emigration. From the Portuguese pioneers in Angola to the rest of the powers that participated in the scramble for Africa, colonizing did not necessarily imply populating. Algeria, and to a certain extent Tunisia and Morocco, constituted the exception. With French colonization of Algeria, the relationship between southern Europe and North Africa that was practically lost since Roman times was to be recovered again. Algeria became a very attractive place for agricultural colonization, and by the early 20th century there were 150,000 European settlers, not only French but also Italian and Spanish, and the figure was going to continue increasing throughout the first half of the 20th century. Tunisia attracted a small percentage of the massive Italian emigration toward the end of the 19th century, and some Spaniards opted for nearby Morocco to settle down. More impenetrable than Africa for the masses of European migrants was the Asian continent. Except for the Russians, who colonized the Eurasian steppes in Siberia, no other power showed genuine interest, let alone capacity, to send large contingents of subjects to settle indefinitely in Asia. British India was never seen as a posting where migrant population could be sent. On the contrary, despite the fact that it was the jewel in the crown of the empire, the British Raj was seen as a world that was far too different and complicated for a British family to settle there indefinitely. The British considered that their mission was to govern, administer, and generate wealth, but not to populate a land that was already well populated by diverse indigenous people. According to an 1861 census, India had a British population of 125,945 people, of whom 84,083 belonged to the armed forces. The rest worked in diverse colonial departments, and a small percentage was associated with the world of business or some liberal profession. For the great majority, their presence in India was linked to the colonial administration. Nevertheless, after 2 centuries of colonization, an Anglo-Indian community emerged. It was formed by British people who were born in India or had spent a great part of their lives there, and therefore felt that their identity was not exclusively British. General George Roberts, the first Earl Roberts, belonged to this community. He was born in Kanpur in 1832, the son of an army officer serving in India, and it was there where he spent the most important part of his outstanding military career. The most famous member of the Anglo-Indian community was undoubtedly Rudyard Kipling. Kipling was born in Bombay in 1865 into a middle-class family that had emigrated to India for professional reasons. Although he also lived in England for a substantial part of his life and traveled extensively through the British Empire, it was his native India and Bombay where he spent an idyllic childhood that was to inspire his most famous works. For some British soldiers, civil servants, or diplomats, Asia became the place where they spent most of their lives as a result of their professional postings. People from these professions could be sent not only to India, but also to Burma, Ceylon, Singapore, or Hong Kong, and many of them rotated between different postings until they became great experts on the Asian world. As Benjamin Disraeli, who was always fascinated by the Eastern world, wrote in his novel Tancred, "The East is a career, and many of them made of Asia a lifelong professional posting." One of the pioneers in making a career out of the East was Stamford Raffles, known as the founding father of Singapore, for the greatest feat in his life was to found the city in 1819. After arriving in Malaysia as assistant to the governor of Penang, in 1805 Raffles was going to devote the rest of his professional life to expanding the British dominion over this part of Asia. He also devoted much time to the study of its people and their culture, which culminated with an influential history of Java. The history of colonial Hong Kong was to be linked to an exclusive community of Crown representatives like Harry Parkes. Parkes arrived in China in 1841 and spent the rest of his life in this part of the world. After more than 20 years of distinguished diplomatic service in China, he was also posted in Japan and Korea. In the case of neighboring Macau, the result of a Portuguese presence since the mid-16th century was the emergence of a Macanese community, formed mainly by those who were posted there by the Portuguese crown. Their descendants, very often mixed-race Portuguese citizens, cherished their Portuguese identity, although very often they spent their whole lives in Asia. In the Spanish Philippines, the Spanish community of emigrants was always very small, as very few Spaniards ventured to travel so far, apart from those who were posted there on official duty. Nevertheless, the economic history of the Philippine archipelago was deeply marked by the feats of outstanding Spanish emigrants like Antonio de Ayala. Ayala launched business ventures in the 1830s in partnership with the German industrialist Andreas Sobel. As a result of it, the Ayala Corporation was to emerge, which up to the present has been one of the most powerful business groups in this part of the world, and their descendants, the Sobel de Ayala family, are very influential. Emigration was the inseparable companion of European empires in their process of expansion. In consequence, colonization became synonymous with populating, and this colonizing population and its descendants were going to make it possible for Western culture to occupy such a predominant place in the world. Overseas empires gave European powers the opportunity to propagate their influence through all continents, particularly through the Americas and Oceania, which were scarcely populated until the arrival of the Europeans. Despite the fact that European imperial powers had managed to spread their culture through a substantial part of the world between the 16th and the 18th centuries, they lacked sufficient population to send over to all occupied territories, and in this way consolidate their influence in the world. Nevertheless, this situation radically changed in the 19th century. Throughout this century, a great part of Europe experienced a demographic explosion. Technological innovations brought by the Industrial Revolution improved the conditions for traveling and settling in increasingly remote areas of the planet. The great waves of European migration that started in the 19th century and continued until well into the 20th century were to give the imperial expansion a special meaning and managed to propagate European influence well beyond the colonial world. The fact that the great majority of emigrants settled in America had a crucial importance in the development of this continent, from Canada to Argentina. Without the constant injection of European migration, the territorial expansion of the United States would not have been so successful, nor would it have had the spectacular growth that transformed this country into the largest economy in the world after 1900. Its values and signs of identity as a superpower would not have been the same without the contribution of the Europeans. European migration also contributed to strengthen the identity of the nations that emerged from the Iberian empires as Western nations, especially Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and Uruguay. European emigration to North and South America made the emergence of a new Atlantic civilization possible. In consequence, the world economy was to become increasingly dependent on the activities between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. John Eliot, Empires of the Atlantic World, Britain and Spain in America, 1492-1830. p. 175. Cayman, Empire. John Eliot, Empires of the Atlantic World. Ibid. Eliot, Empires of the Atlantic World. #Ibid. Ibid. Sidney W. Mintz, Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. Ibid. Neil Ferguson, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World. Ferguson, Empire. #Burke, Old World, New World. Fernandez Armesto, Civilizations. Thomas, The Slave Trade. Fernandez Armesto, Civilizations. Thomas J. Archdeacon, Becoming American, An Ethnic History. Archdeacon, Becoming American. #Ibid. Stephen Birmingham, The Rest of Us, The Rise of America's Eastern European Jews. Ibid. Archdeacon, Becoming American. Raymond Carr, Spain 1808-1975. Maria Sáenz Quesada, La Argentina, Historia del País y de su Gente. #Sáenz Quesada, La Argentina. Ibid. Sáenz Quesada, La Argentina. Winston Churchill, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, The Great Democracies, Vol. 4. Churchill, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Ibid. #Churchill, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Churchill, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. James, Raj. Victoria Glendinning, Raffles and the Golden Opportunity. The Power and the Glory. The Golden Era of European Hegemony. The 19th century was the European century par excellence, a time when European civilization was at the height of its powers and Europe was the center of the world, projecting its influence to the remotest parts of the planet. At that time, Europe experienced the most remarkable scientific and technological progress, making the Industrial Revolution possible. Great powers continued expanding until they consolidated global colonial empires. Against this backdrop of industrial and imperial expansion, the peoples of Europe experienced great social and economic changes. The continent also became the world's intellectual hub, from which political ideas emerged that have transformed the entire world. Rising living standards and increasing leisure contributed to the birth of culture as an industry that has been entertaining and cultivating minds and influencing people's thoughts since then. The ultimate consequence of this age of improvement and progress was the emergence of what became identified as a European way of life. This was synonymous with progress, excellence, and the highest forms of civilization. It attracted Americans and other members of the Western world who reproduced it in their own countries. Even some members of elites in other civilizations followed the European way of life and attempted to incorporate it into their own culture, as they considered that Europeanization was the key to success. The term European progress must be used with caution. Evidently, there were substantial differences between the great powers and the rest of the European nations, and between industrial nations and those that remained agricultural. But even so, there was an ethos of progress and an aura of superiority that the peoples of Europe had in common. Europeans grew increasingly aware of the magnitude of their achievements and leading role in the world. This was not only the case with those who lived in the European continent but particularly among those who emigrated or were posted abroad. What can justly be described as the European Golden Era began in 1815 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars and was to last until 1914. Peace was one of the crucial factors that made it possible. Between 1814 and 1815, the coalition of powers that defeated Napoleon met at the Congress of Vienna with the overall aim of ensuring a lasting peace and putting an end to this era of upheaval that had kept the continent at war for over 20 years. This gave way to what was called the Concert of Europe, a system of dispute resolution primarily based on keeping balance of power between the four main powers that had won the war: Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Its main proponent was Prince Metternich, who represented Austria and acted as host in the Vienna Congress. His aim was to maintain the balance of power among Austria and other major powers by holding regular conferences where disputes would be amicably solved. He was also determined to oppose revolutionary movements and keep the rising ideologies of nationalism and liberalism under control. The Concert of Europe has been criticized as a reactionary agreement that ultimately failed to prevent nationalism and liberalism from making progress. Nevertheless, it did achieve its main aim of keeping peace in Europe for over a century. It is true, however, that there were revolutions and wars between several countries, but on the whole peace prevailed until 1914. More than ever, this was a time when the philosopher Immanuel Kant's dream of perpetual peace in Europe, where nations would peacefully trade with each other, seemed to come true. As a result of this, Prince Metternich became the most influential statesman in the 19th century, after Napoleon. He was a source of inspiration for several statesmen, particularly the U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who wrote his doctoral thesis at Harvard University on the Austrian prince and the Congress system and was to apply his principles of balance of power during the Cold War. The international order established at the Congress of Vienna was the closest that Europe has come to universal governance since the collapse of Charlemagne's empire. It produced a consensus that peaceful evolutions within the existing order were preferable to any other alternative, that the preservation of the system was more important than any single dispute that might arise within it, and that differences should be settled by consultation rather than by war. The second factor determining the Golden Age was the Industrial Revolution, which led to one of the most profound changes in human history. As a consequence, a transition to new manufacturing processes was made possible by new technology, and societies where it took place were rapidly transformed from rural to industrial and urban. The main beneficiary in its initial stages was obviously Britain, where the revolution began. This greatly consolidated its position as the leading world power. But soon several countries in Western Europe were going to join this revolution, as well as the United States and Canada. Industrial nations not only enjoyed technological superiority and an extraordinary improvement in living standards, but above all they became fabulously rich in comparison to all other countries. The gap in terms of economic development and quality of life separating them from the rest of the world was progressively increasing throughout the 19th century. From 1870 to 1913, Western Europe came to represent 33% of the world's gross domestic product. European industrialization largely contributed to the Industrial Revolution in the United States by exporting the capital, technology, and labor that made it possible. Last but not least, expansion throughout the globe continued strengthening Europe's position in the world. The process of discovery and exploration that Europeans had begun in the 15th century speeded up in the 19th. Technology and scientific improvements allowed Europeans to reach the last confines of the earth and penetrate the remotest territories that until then seemed impossible. Africa, which had remained virtually unexplored, was finally opened up. Once the heart of Africa was explored, a rapid process of partition of the continent between the great powers ensued. In the meantime, colonial empires continued to grow in other continents. While the British reached the Pacific coast of Canada, the French reached Southeast Asia, and the Russians made remarkable progress with the colonization of Siberia. Trade networks expanded more than ever to include China and Japan, and the new principle of free trade started to make steady progress, considerably strengthening the market economy. In this process, Europeans acquired a larger capacity to shape the world according to their interests as well as their values. If the 19th century was a golden era for Europe on the whole, this was particularly the case for Britain, as this was the British century par excellence. Europe's impact on the world was to a large extent the result of Britain's extraordinary performance. From the Battle of Waterloo to the Boer War in 1901, Britain took advantage of a series of favorable circumstances that allowed it to consolidate the largest empire the world had ever seen and consolidate a model of society that was universally admired. In 1825, the engineer George Stephenson invented the locomotive, perhaps the most important invention of the 19th century, as it made railways possible, radically changing human transport. A few years later, Isambard Brunel, one of the most ingenious figures in the history of engineering, designed the first railway system and founded the Great Western Railway that connected London with Wales. Railways soon rapidly spread not only across the whole of the British Isles but also a substantial part of the British Empire. India was soon to have the best railway system in Asia. British railway companies proliferated from southern Europe to Latin America. British banking and its increasingly sophisticated financial system funded this remarkable expansion throughout the world, including the United States, until the early 20th century. Britain also exported much of the material that was used by other nations in order to build railways. From the mid-19th century, a system that allowed the population to be transported by train was an essential element in any nation in the world that aspired to be modern and prosperous. Britain for a long time enjoyed the benefits of this great invention. It was the main exporter not only of steam engines but of all sorts of tools essential in the industrial era, including textile equipment, as initially Britain was also a pioneer in textiles and heavy industry. Britain implemented one of the most important economic principles, which was to have a deep impact on its economy and eventually on the whole world: free trade. In the 1840s, mercantilism was abandoned and replaced by free trade. The critical moment came in 1846 with the repeal of the Corn Laws, which had imposed stiff tariffs on imported grain. From then on, the British market was open to unfettered competition, grain prices fell and food became more abundant. A wide range of products experienced the same process, leading to a reduction of prices and an expansion of wealth. Two great British classical economists had contributed to the idea of free trade. Adam Smith extolled the advantages of the division of labor, while David Ricardo explained the theory of trade.
But it was thanks to the manufacturer and liberal politician Richard Cobden that free trade was finally put into practice. Cobden had co-founded the Anti-Corn Law League in 1838 with the aim of abolishing the Corn Laws, which mainly protected landowners' interests. Cobden campaigned for free trade not only in Britain, but also in Europe and America. He considered that free trade would be the greatest revolution of all time. It would draw men together and make the whole world become one country, and it would be the best way of bringing universal and permanent peace. Lord Palmerston espoused this idea of free trade when he argued that commerce is the best pioneer of civilization, making mankind happier, wiser, and better. This justified the Opium Wars, arguing that no regime had the right to deny its benefits to its own people. In 1860, the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty was signed, by which Britain and France agreed to eliminate trade duties between the two countries. The idea that constituted the essence of liberal economics had finally triumphed. From 1860 until the Great Depression in 1930s, free trade spread rapidly through the world with great benefits for the economy. British benefits from the export of industrial products and technology steadily increased, and this also contributed to their expansion throughout the world. Food became considerably cheaper, as well as manufacturing goods, all of which had a very positive impact on British living standards. In 1851 the Great Exhibition was inaugurated by Queen Victoria at the Crystal Palace, itself a symbol of industrial prowess, made out of prefabricated iron and glass. Britain was the leading industrial power, producing half its own iron, coal, and cotton cloth. From then it became known as the workshop of the world. As manufactured goods dominated world trade, this had a substantial impact on British wealth. Between 1870 and 1900 economic output per head of population in Britain and Ireland rose by a staggering 500%. No less extraordinary was the transformation of British politics and society in those decades. Dickensian Britain is associated with the grinding poverty, social injustices, and the hardship of life endured by the majority of the British population, as described by Charles Dickens in his popular novels that became world classics. Britain's population rose from 8 million in 1801 to over 15 million in 1851. A large percentage migrated to the burgeoning industrial towns in search of work and a better life than they had in their rural birthplaces. The populations of Manchester and Sheffield quadrupled in this period. That of Glasgow and Bradford grew eightfold. In 1851 Britain became the world's first urban nation. These drastic social changes and the problems suffered by the emerging proletariat was to inspire a whole generation of thinkers, social reformers, and politicians whose ideas and proposals on how to improve society not only transformed Britain but eventually the rest of the world. This was the time of Jeremy Bentham, founder of modern utilitarianism, describing utility as the sum of all pleasure that results from an action, minus the suffering of anyone involved in the action. He also advocated the greatest happiness of the greatest number to be the foundation of morals and legislation. Philanthropic businessman Robert Owen aimed to change human society and campaigned for cooperative societies, factory regulation, and trade unions. William Cobbett, the pamphleteer and farmer, campaigned for reforming Parliament and against the Corn Laws because they contributed to rural poverty. The idea of Britain in the Golden Era is synonymous with Victorian Britain. Strictly speaking, this was the reign of Queen Victoria, from 1837 to 1901. Throughout her long reign, Victoria made the monarchy reach the highest levels of popularity. She contributed to consolidate constitutional monarchy as a political system that provided stability. The fact that she became the matriarch of a Europe-wide royal clan played an important role spreading this model of government, but it was above all the prestige that the crown acquired in her lifetime that was to make constitutional monarchy popular both in Europe and in many parts of the world. Queen Victoria ruled strictly according to how the editor of The Economist, Walter Bagehot, defined a constitutional monarchy, independent of private interests and above party politics, in which the rights and duties of the monarch were to be consulted, to encourage and to warn. Victorian was a very powerful word in modern history, as it defined most of what had made Britain great. Victorian values on the whole could be considered somewhat contradictory, but all of them together seem to give the explanation for such an extraordinary age. Victorians believed in progress, for otherwise rapid industrialization would never have taken place. They also believed in tradition, allowing old customs to survive in spite of all the sweeping changes that took place in those decades. For example, the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest was created in 1894, to preserve country houses and the heritage that was threatened by property development and industrialization. In the 20th century it evolved as the largest heritage organization in the world. Freedom was another sign of identity for the Victorians. They saw themselves as a traditionally free, having never been victims of tyranny like so many European nations. This explains why Britain developed the smallest central government machinery ever found in an industrial society. This also contributed to the respect for Crown and Parliament as symbols of the country's ancient liberties. Respectability was another sign of Victorian identity, as the British struggled for self-respect and at the same time to promote a respectable civil society. While Samuel Smiles's book Self-Help became a bestseller, charities proliferated more than ever. Finally, the Victorians were religious, and those who were not at least believed in the ethics of Protestantism, Puritanism, self-restraint, and finally thrift. As regards the system of government, it was during the Victorian era that the House of Commons and the House of Lords at Westminster became a universally admired bastion of democracy. Although by our contemporary standards the British parliamentary system left a lot to be desired, it provided a stable government that proved capable of avoiding revolutionary upheavals while introducing important progressive reforms and defending Britain's interests in the world. This was achieved by consolidating a two-party system, alternating in power. The Tories stood for tradition and the Liberals for change. The two most well-known party leaders were Gladstone and Disraeli. They had great differences in personality and background, but they both had solid Victorian values in common. Gladstone was deeply religious and believed in social progress. Disraeli craved tradition and individual freedom. The fact that Disraeli made such a remarkable political career despite the fact that he was born into a Jewish family is in itself an indication of how open British society was, as this would have been inconceivable in most of Europe at that time. British foreign policy in the post-Napoleonic era can be summarized by Lord Palmerston's famous maxim, "We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies." Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. In a career that spanned over 4 decades, Palmerston, who served both as Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, was to put his words into practice with considerable success. The Crimean War was a good example. This brief war was caused by British opposition to Russia, a former ally, expanding into the Crimea. The government also showed determination to defend the private interests of individual citizens wherever they would be, as the David Pacifico affair in 1850 showed. David Pacifico was a Jew working in Athens as a Portuguese consul, whose house was vandalized in anti-Semitic demonstrations. The Greek government refused to compensate him, and Pacifico, who was a naturalized British citizen, turned to the British government for help. Palmerston reacted by sending a squadron of the Royal Navy and imposing a blockade over Athens's port of Piraeus. The Greek government budged and promptly agreed to settle Pacifico's claim. Palmerston justified his actions in Parliament with one of his most brilliant speeches, which was to be known as Civis Romanus Sum, in which he explained that the interests of British citizens were to be defended at all costs throughout the world, with the same determination as those of Roman citizens in Imperial Rome. Not long after, similar principles of defending British interests led the British to send the Royal Navy to China, leading to the Opium War. British foreign policy from the 1860s was inspired by what was later going to be defined as splendid isolation, based on the principle that the best way of serving the country's interest was by avoiding any entanglement in European alliances or conflicts, and focusing on expanding British interests in the world. It very much contributed to the strengthening and expansion of the British Empire, which reached its apogee toward the last 3 decades of the 19th century. The empire, which was acquired, according to Seeley, in a fit of absence of mind, occupied a central place in the British government from the 1870s. The first Prime Minister to focus on the expansion of its frontiers was Benjamin Disraeli. He was responsible for the purchase of Suez Canal shares that ultimately turned Egypt into a British protectorate. He reached an agreement with the Ottoman Empire to occupy Cyprus, preventing the Russians from doing so. He also ordered British troops to march into Afghanistan before Russia was tempted to take over. Disraeli was convinced that the British Empire was a force of good, and he was determined to make it popular among the British public. His initiative of granting Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India provoked considerable controversy in Britain, as many people brought up under austere Victorian morality considered it an unnecessary extravagance inspired by exotic myths. But the British Prime Minister justified it in this way: the Empress Queen who governed over the greatest empire on earth would have the same imperial rank as the Russian Tsar, the German Kaiser or the Emperor of Austria. Disraeli, for whom the Queen felt great affection, succeeded with this aim, as from then the British monarchy became fully aware of its imperial duties. To visit India and the main possessions of the empire became an obligation for. Imperialism became an increasingly popular cause, as Disraeli could appreciate, but it was also a risky one, for the difficulties in the South African War and in Afghanistan led the Conservatives to electoral defeat in 1880. But if territorial conquests could have a high price from the electoral point of view, retreats were even worse, as Prime Minister Gladstone was to see. The Liberal Prime Minister, who was always a reluctant imperialist, was not willing to continue with his rival's expansionist policy on returning to power. But his decision to withdraw from the Sudan in 1885 when it was attacked by the Khedive of Egypt, and abandon General Charles Gordon to his fate, was considered by British public opinion an insult to national pride, and it precipitated the end of Gladstone's government. The organization and administration of such a large and diverse empire occupied a central place in British politics. It acquired a solid and well-coordinated administrative structure by which a small elite of specially trained civil servants kept law and order in colonies throughout the world. Several generations of British professional elites educated in the top public schools were imbibed the imperial ethos and then developed a passion for it. Officers from Sandhurst Academy, from Gordon to Churchill, were well aware that postings in colonial regiments offered the opportunity for quick promotion and adventure. Oxford and Cambridge graduates often joined the India Office or other colonial departments with the aim of being posted in an empire that was full of attractive places that offered British functionaries more money, comfort, and above all a much more interesting life. The most important post in each colony was that of governor, to which the empire's most ambitious servants aspired. Especially relevant was the post of Viceroy of India, created in 1858 to replace that of the Governor-General. It was given a grandiose name in order to confer it the rank of Crown's representative to the person who would have to deal with the sovereigns of the Indian states. The British government was well aware of the differences between ruling over territories that were inhabited by peoples who were considered backward and those populated by a majority of European settlers. The latter became more conflictive, for they demanded the same right as white settlers to govern themselves. This led to the creation of the Dominion status, which allowed self-government in everything except foreign and defense policy. The first colony to become a Dominion was Canada in 1867, followed by Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa in the early 20th century. In a visit to Australia in 1884, Lord Rosebery described the empire as a commonwealth of nations. Shortly afterward, in an imperial congress in 1887, the term began to be used mainly in reference to the so-called White Dominions. This formula by which several territories of the empire became practically independent nations allowed the life of the British Empire to retain its popularity among many subjects, and it prolonged its life considerably. It allowed the governing elites to spread democracy, the rule of law, the market economy, and all that they considered positive from the motherland. In 1885 the radical liberal politician Joseph Chamberlain acceded to join the Conservative government, and requested a post that had been generally neglected until then, that of Colonial Secretary, as he believed that nothing was more important in British politics than the administration of the largest empire in the world. He was well aware that he was living in an era of imperialism. The day of small nations has passed away. The day of empires has come, he stated on one occasion, and of course he was absolutely convinced that the British Empire had a very special role to play among all other empires as a force of good. It is not enough to occupy great spaces of the world unless you can make the best of them. For this reason he believed that the empire should be remodeled as a federation of Anglo-Saxon nations, peacefully trading with each other under British principles. But Chamberlain Toward the end of the 19th century, the empire became a very popular cause, and this explains why it continued expanding. Lord Salisbury, the most influential statesman in the last 15 years of the Victorian era, defined himself as a reluctant imperialist. But even so, on the 3 occasions in which he was Prime Minister, Britain consolidated a new colonial empire in Africa. As Salisbury commented to the French ambassador in relation to his African policy, le petit vient en mangeant. Defending the British Empire implied on most occasions expanding it. Lord Salisbury complained that his advisers would have liked to annex the Moon in order to prevent its being appropriated by the planet Mars. This led Britain to rule over a quarter of the Earth, and around 450 million people, a fifth of the world's population, was under British sovereignty. Never had an empire ruled over so many people. As all first world powers in history, Britain in its golden era was both envied and admired. Because of its transport and communication technology, and the global nature of its empire, it enjoyed more external influence than any other empire in history. It was seen as a leader in this European civilization that dominated the world. The British were also seen as a kind of aristocracy of the world, which explains why the British way of life was admired and imitated beyond the confines of its empire. The British gentleman, with his sartorial habits and his code of conduct according to the highest standards, inspired educated men in the whole of the Western world and beyond it. The middle and upper classes throughout the world adopted habits like drinking tea and practicing British sports, while the splendor of stately English homes was reproduced by the lucky few who were rich enough to imitate it. All this had a great impact on how the British perceived themselves, and largely contributed to the development of a sense of superiority. To be English is to win the first ticket in the lottery of life, stated the imperialist businessman Cecil Rhodes. I believe that the British race is the greatest of the governing races that the world has ever seen, said Joseph Chamberlain. Self-confidence and pride in their civilization contributed to make the British propagate their interests more than ever at this time. Another great protagonist in this era of European splendor was undoubtedly France. In spite of its defeat in 1815 and all the subsequent political turbulence, the French in the 19th century were also at the height of their powers and played a significant contribution propagating European influence through the world. The French Revolution bequeathed a very important political legacy that has shaped politics in Europe, the West, and eventually the rest of the world. The notion of right and left as a way of classifying ideologies in politics was invented in France. After 1789, the members of the National Assembly were divided into 2 groups. Those who supported the revolution, known as the Party of Movement, sat on the left, and those supporting the king, known as the Party of Order, sat on the right. From then, to be on the left implied believing in the principles of the Enlightenment that inspired the French Revolution, and the subsequent revolutions that broke out in Europe. Left-wingers believed that all men were equal, and it should be the role of the government to ensure that this equality of opportunities or equality before the law was strictly applied. They also believed that the eradication of poverty and oppression was implicit in a society where wealth and power was in the hands of a privileged minority, and in order to do this it was the right of the state to distribute wealth by means of taxation, or even expropriation of private property. The left considered that science and technology were useful weapons for achieving progress, and that neither religious beliefs nor ancient traditions should stand in the way of bringing about genuine progress in society. Made human beings very different. For this reason, maintaining the hierarchical structure of society, with the crown and the nobility at the top, and the church as representative of God and repository of ancient wisdom, ought to be preserved. Law, order, and tradition ought to be upheld before any change. Private property should also be respected. Poverty could be alleviated in a compassionate society. The monarchy of Louis-Philippe, from 1830 to 1848, constituted a brave attempt to incorporate ideas of the left into an institution that was conservative by nature. The regime that replaced it, that of Napoleon III, claimed to be loyal to the legacy of the French Revolution. The Third Republic, the most successful and lasting French regime of the 19th century, consolidated the Republic in France by transforming the President of the Republic into an elected president, who retained all the pomp and grandeur of the old monarchy. It was a model of a republic that was to inspire many republican regimes in the world. What all 19th century regimes had in common was their determination to expand French influence throughout the world. The colonization of Algeria, which began in 1830, was followed by more daring conquests. In 1848, Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected president of the French Republic, and 4 years later he proclaimed himself emperor under the title of Napoleon III. As a good Bonaparte, he was convinced that France represented the highest level of civilization and ought to be expanded, and since it was no longer possible to do it within the frontiers of Europe, as his uncle had done, his aim was to do it overseas. While he was in power, from 1848 to 1870, French overseas territories increased in 3 continents: Asia, with the occupation of Indochina; Oceania, with the acquisition of Polynesia; and Madagascar in Africa. Napoleon even attempted to build a new empire in Mexico and fill the vacuum left by Spain. In 1861,